This is part one of the lecture Depression and Political Crisis in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And because I deal with three countries in this lecture, it's broken up into three parts. None is all that long, but I thought it was easier to break it into three parts. So what we're really looking at here is the political change that took place in these three countries, or changes that took place in these three countries, brought on by the Great Depression. And if we think about the Great Depression for a minute, just recall that this is now, the ultimate challenge to the liberal economic order, that trade comes to a halt because economies in the West are suffering. Commodity prices drop, there's tremendous unemployment. And you see that in the United States with a change in government after the 1932 election with Franklin Roosevelt, and there's change in many, many places in the world. Well, in South America, the changes are most pronounced in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. And by the end of the decade, Chile had what's known as a Popular Front government. That means that there was a coalition of a middle class, kind of white collar political party, doctors, lawyers, that kind of thing, with members of the Socialist Party and even the Communist Party. They governed Chile for close to a decade, in the late 30s into the mid to late 30s into the mid 1940s. Argentina had a democracy, and it got rid of that and returned to a dictatorship that looked a lot like the 19th century. And then Brazil had a series of forms of dictatorship that promised to be more open and this and that. And politically, it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what we can call these governments in the 1930s, all under the rule of one man, who we'll discuss. But they were fundamentally different from what had preceded them. Now, what's so interesting about these three cases at this time is the incredibly central role played by the middle classes in each country. They were the key. Not because, as many people argue, a middle-class society is a more democratic society. There are plenty of examples of very conservative, anti-democratic middle-class political systems. But the middle classes were very opportunistic, and they wanted more political power. And in some cases, that meant saying, well, the best way to get it is to open the system up. But what we really see in all three cases is a middle class that is willing to make alliances with different groups to get them some more say in the political system. And the type of alliance and how it played out is all very much shaped by the existing political system. So if we understand politics as a series of alliances, and this is admittedly a crude way of doing things, but it helps kind of sort things out, particularly when we're looking at so many countries, we can see that elites and middle-class groups and urban workers really interacted. And that's the best word, because sometimes they agreed and sometimes they disagreed, and they shaped politics in these three countries. The middle class always sought increased political participation, whether that was through open elections or through a dictatorship. And same with the working class. Elites, their main goal is always to stay elites, to maintain power. Now, there's an obviously missing group here, and that's anyone in the rural sector other than rural elites. The peasantry and rural proletarians had very, very little to do with the politics in these countries at this time. So what we see is that these alliances are all about challenging whatever was in existence at the time of the Great Depression. And what was in existence largely was, although Argentina is a little bit of an exception, we'll get to, free trade, a liberal economic order without a lot of open politics. So let's first look at the case of Chile, which, if you recall, after its civil wars, had at least a way to incorporate more people. And Chile has the longest system that allows democracy. But what you have to understand is that at times the system was closed down and quite dictatorial, and other times it opened up. It's not a smooth, ongoing path of democracy. And when the Great Depression hit, this dramatically affected Chile. Now, again, if you think back to the previous lecture on Chile, the people who continually won those civil wars were exporters. And in the aftermath of the 1891 Civil War, the rising copper sector is essentially taken over by Americans. So Chile is incredibly dependent on the export trade. And so when export demand for, all of the minerals coming out of Chile just drops like a stone, and therefore prices drop, we have a series of political machinations. And one of the most fascinating is the 12-day presidency of a guy with the wonderful name of Marmaduke Grovi. He was an Air Force officer, and he was a socialist. And so there are a couple things that are kind of unique here. A, we have the military, but B, it's a part of the military that's very, very left-wing. Well, he's in power for 12 days, and he tries to do a lot of things to transform the society in 12 days. And the reason that's important is he puts a lot of laws in the books that are later used. But the military leadership, which is much more conservative, ends his brief socialist republic. And they call for elections. And the Conservative Party candidate, a guy named Arturo Alessandri, won the presidency. Now, this is an election with a somewhat narrow franchise. It's probably the most open election in Latin America in the 1930s. But the conservatives win, and Alessandri in 1936 declares a state of siege to end a lot of protests. There's been a tremendous amount of protest against his government, and also people calling for the government to take a more active role in improving their lives. So we've got demands for mediation of strikes. We've got demands for increases in pay and better conditions. We've got demands from women to get the right to vote. This is when the feminist movement really starts to take hold, and we see this kind of combination of everything from better wages and work conditions to just simply more democracy in the society, more equal rights. And it's an incredibly important era in the mid-1930s. Now, there's Alessandri. He had been president in the 1920s, and he's extremely conservative. And I think it's fair to say that the extreme nature of his conservatism really helped all these groups that had been involved in strikes and in the feminist movement and all these sorts of things to come together because they had a common enemy in Alessandri. And so they come together and they form a new political coalition. And it's an alliance of the Communist Party, the Socialists, the Radical Party. Now, this Radical Party, it's not terribly radical. It comes from a French Radical Party, which was very much a kind of white-collar worker, middle-class professionals. And they're all men. I mean, there are women backing it, but the women don't have the right to vote yet. They're all coming together to formally, as a coalition, oppose conservative rule. And they formally declare themselves something called the Popular Front in 1937. Now, this term is a little complicated. I mentioned in a previous lecture how the Soviet Union actually dictated what communist parties throughout the world should do. And Stalin in the late 1930s was increasingly worried about Hitler. And what he thought was important was that the communist parties throughout the world make peace with the more progressive middle-class parties, whether that was the Democratic Party in the United States or a series of socialist and labor parties. And he formally called for them to make alliances with these parties, and they called them Popular Front governments. So this was something that Chileans wanted. It was something the Communist Party thought was a good idea. And they're so successful that they end up electing a radical, with a capital R, so very much a middle-class guy, named Pedro Aguirre Cerda, president and he serves as president in this coalition from 1937 to 41. Now, what's interesting about the coalition is that it's the socialists who actually see themselves as to the left of the communists. Well, that's meaningless. It's the socialists who pull out of the coalition. And from 1941 to 1947, the radicals and the communists run Chile. So from 37 to 47, we've got this sort of center-left government. And later they call themselves the Democratic Alliance. Now, 1947 is the year that the Cold War kind of formally comes to Latin America. The United States pressures Latin American countries to get rid of their communist parties. But how does this happen? Well, if we go back to the idea of alliances, we can help sort things out. Now, the first thing to recall is that in the aftermath of the 1891 Civil War, the political parties began to represent distinct groups. So you would have socialists and communists and radical and conservative parties. But the other thing is, unlike this, and through the parliament, they have more and more power. And the thing to know that's different about the 1930s from the 1890s and the 1850s is now the elite is really quite unified. Those periods, there was a very divided elite, and different groups, middling groups could plug into them. Now with a unified elite, the rising middle class had no option other than to make ties with the working class. And again, the reason they can, well, first of all, they have to do it because the elite's not going to have them. But the reason they can do it is that this quasi-parliamentary system, this more open political system, means that representatives of the working class have political power. And so what the middle class is able to do is turn to workers who now have their own political parties and make a rather robust alliance. So the middle class and the organized left became the groups most associated with opposition to the conservatives. They became most associated with the notion of expanding democracy and increasing access to social justice. And that's going to become really important. So really from the mid-1930s, really through today, there is this sense that an alliance of these middle-class groups and left-wing groups are the ones who represent the more democratic traditions of Chile, and the Conservative Party and the conservatives represent the less democratic, more oligarchical, rule by a few traditions in that nation.